Dawn broke over the Normandy countryside with thin, pale light that did little to soften the destruction. Fields were torn into mud and trenches, hedgerows shredded like paper, and the distant horizon shimmered with smoke from burning tanks and shattered villages. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, blood, and wet earth, mingling in a way that made each breath a reminder that the world had turned to chaos. Dr. Emil Reinhardt adjusted his surgical mask, stained and fraying at the edges, and stepped out from the makeshift field hospital, a battered farmhouse pressed into service as a triage center. Every surface inside had been converted into a table, a cot, or a surface for treating the wounded. Blood pooled in corners, mingling with a hay that still smelled faintly of livestock. The groans, cries, and whispered prayers of men half dead filled the space, punctuated by the occasional barked order from an NCO trying to maintain some semblance of order. Outside, the first sound of enemy fire echoed across the countryside. Artillery shells screamed in arcs, landing with shattering explosions that shook the ground beneath Emil's feet. Men and horses screamed in terror as shrapnel tore through earth and timber, yet the doctor's attention did not waver. Each patient was a puzzle: a torn artery, a crushed leg, a lung punctured by a stray bullet. Decisions had to be made in seconds: who would live, who could be saved, who could not. Emil's hands moved with mechanical precision, though his mind raced. A young soldier lay on the table before him, chest open and lungs collapsing with every shallow breath. Emil cut away torn fabric, rinsed the wound, and pressed a makeshift clamp to staunch the bleeding. The boy's eyes met Emil's, wide with pain and fear, and Emil gave a small, grim smile. "You'll make it," he whispered. He didn't know if it was true, but it was all he could offer. A sudden eruption of machine gun fire rattled the walls of the farmhouse. Emil froze, scalp tingling. The sound was unmistakable. The Germans were closer than they should have been. Reinforcements, yes, but also the vanguard probing the Allied defenses. Orders from the front had been clear. The field hospital was to be moved whenever possible, yet this farmhouse was all they had. The only escape route snaked through broken fields under the open sky, exposed to shells and bullets. Emil knew that if the Germans realized the hospital's position, no one inside would survive. The next patient arrived on a stretcher, carried by two soldiers, blood dripping from a shattered arm. Emil barked instructions to his assistants, improvising a sling from torn sheets. He worked feverishly, ignoring the tremor in his hands, the sweat running down his neck, the screams outside. Time was measured in breaths and heartbeats, and every second counted. Another shell landed nearby, the farmhouse shaking violently. Dust and plaster rained down, covering everything in a fine gray film. Emil's assistants flinched, some crouching instinctively under tables, but Emil remained standing, scalpel in hand, eyes fixed on the patient before him. The doctor's mind flashed to his own training. Nights spent in the operating theater, hands steady over healthy flesh, controlled environment, predictable. Here, none of that existed. The heart still beat erratically in the chest before him, but the world around was chaos. A bullet could strike through the wall, a shell could collapse the roof, and in an instant, every life he sought to save could be extinguished. Through the shattered window, Emil caught sight of figures moving through the fields, German soldiers, advancing methodically, sweeping the land with rifles and binoculars. Smoke curled from their mortars, carrying an acrid, choking scent. The sounds of battle grew louder with each passing second. Emil did not move from the patient's side. Instead, he barked orders to a young medic, who passed him a blood-soaked tourniquet. With practiced precision, Emil wrapped the injured arm, pressed firmly, then moved to the next wound. Minutes passed, or was it hours? In this blur of adrenaline and horror, time had little meaning. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistle cut through the din, an incoming shell. Emil's head ducked instinctively, arms protecting the patient. The explosion ripped the earth near the farmhouse, sending splinters and debris across the floor. A nearby cot was thrown across the room, its occupant screaming in terror. Emil ignored it, moving to secure another patient, his mind calculating doses, pressure points, and survival odds simultaneously. The first light of dawn was no longer soft. It was a harsh, gray illumination over a battlefield strewn with mud, blood, and steel. Emil worked tirelessly, alternating between hands-on surgery and rapid triage, moving from one patient to another, improvising splints, applying pressure to wounds, and monitoring vitals. Each decision was life or death, each motion measured in milliseconds. Outside, the German forces crept closer. Recon patrols pushed through hedgerows. Artillery fire aimed to pin down the farmhouse, to trap anyone inside. Emil knew that if they breached the building, he would have no weapons, no protection, only his knowledge, his hands, and his will. Yet he did not falter. The thought of abandoning the wounded was impossible. Each soldier under his care became a reason to fight on. Hours passed. The shelling and gunfire continued in waves, relentless, unyielding. Emil's face was streaked with soot and blood, his coat tattered, hands raw and trembling. But he continued, stitching, clamping, cutting, improvising. Outside, the horizon burned with the smoke of battle. Yet inside the farmhouse, time was measured in heartbeats and the faint rise and fall of lungs. By mid-morning, the immediate wave of enemy fire subsided, leaving a brittle, tense quiet. Emil took a brief moment to breathe, scanning the room. Around him were dozens of men, some stable, some fading, all held together by sheer will and the skill of a single doctor operating under impossible circumstances. He allowed himself a grim smile. One house, one doctor, and a handful of medics had turned a massacre into survival. But the battle was far from over. Reinforcements would arrive. The enemy would regroup. And Emil Reinhardt would have to continue, because for these men, this farmhouse, and this battlefield, there was no other option. And as he leaned over another patient, scalpel in hand, the doctor whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the distant rumble of war, "I cannot fail. Not here. Not now." The farmhouse trembled under the relentless rhythm of artillery fire, each concussion rattling windows and loosening beams. Emil Reinhardt's hands, already raw from hours of operating, moved mechanically, stitching shrapnel wounds, applying pressure to torn arteries, and improvising splints from wooden beams and shattered furniture. Outside, the horizon rippled with movement, German infantry advancing in formation, their rifles flashing with deadly precision, half-tracks clawing through mud toward the farmhouse. Reinforcements had not arrived. Orders from headquarters were lost to static and broken radio lines. Emil knew that if they breached this farmhouse, the wounded inside would have no chance. Every second counted. A medic shouted from the far side of the room, "Incoming! They're flanking us." Emil didn't pause. He applied a final stitch to a soldier with a mangled leg, checking the pulse as he moved toward the next stretcher. The patient's face was pale, eyes wide with fear, but Emil's presence was a tether, a promise that someone still fought for them. Outside, the first wave of German infantry struck the farmhouse's perimeter. Bullets pinged off wood and metal, some embedding themselves dangerously close to the makeshift operating tables. Emil's heart thundered, but his hands remained steady. Each wound demanded attention. Hesitation could cost lives. "Dr. Reinhardt," a medic cried, dragging in a young soldier who had been hit in the chest by shrapnel. "He's fading fast." Emil dropped to his knees, tearing open a man's uniform and assessing the damage. A piece of metal had torn through the diaphragm, and the lung had partially collapsed. Emil's hands moved faster than thought. Clamps, sutures, makeshift ventilations. The man gasped, convulsing under the pain, but Emil's fingers did not falter. A deafening explosion rocked the farmhouse, sending dust and debris into the room. The ceiling groaned, and a support beam cracked above them. Emil barely had time to shield the patient before fragments rained down. The medic screamed, throwing himself flat on the ground. Emil pressed on, one hand stabilizing the young soldier, the other removing debris from the wound. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into eternities. Outside, a half-track attempted to crash through the orchard beside the farmhouse, its machine gun sweeping toward the windows. Emil gritted his teeth. Evacuation was impossible without exposing the wounded to certain death. He scanned the room, dozens of men, some stabilized, some barely clinging to life. Then came the order, "We need to move them. Now." Emil rose, blood dripping from his hands, eyes burning from smoke and sweat. He barked commands to the medics, improvising stretchers from wooden planks and blankets. Each soldier had to be moved carefully, their injuries stabilized enough to survive the short journey across open fields under fire. Outside, the German advance intensified. Artillery shells slammed into the fields, dirt and shrapnel flying toward them. Emil led the first group of wounded, his arms trembling under the weight of 2 men, dragging them through mud and rubble. Bullets whizzed past, striking trees and churned earth. One shell landed too close, sending a geyser of mud over Emil and the patients. He pressed on, mud and blood coating him, ignoring the screams and chaos around him. A half-track opened fire, mowing down a small hedgerow of trees that had offered brief cover. Emil flattened himself against the wall of the building, assessing the safest path. He counted his men, 7 stabilized, 3 critical, 2 too weak to move quickly. Every step required calculation. Speed versus safety, survival versus exposure. He glanced behind him. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now smoldered with small fires and cracks in its walls. German infantry were moving in, creeping closer with disciplined precision. Emil made a split-second decision. Form a line. Carry the critical ones first. The medics obeyed, lifting soldiers onto makeshift stretchers, weaving through the broken orchard as Emil guided them. Bullets tore through the branches, some grazing arms and legs, some striking metal planks with deafening clangs. Every movement was a calculated risk. One misstep could be fatal. Halfway across the open field, Emil stumbled, the weight of 2 men dragging him down. A burst of gunfire erupted from a distant German machine gun nest. He froze for a heartbeat, calculating angles, then shoved forward, ignoring pain in his legs and back. Behind him, a shell hit the ground, throwing a medic off balance. Emil lunged, steadying him, and continued the trek toward the relative safety of the riverbank, where Allied forces had begun forming a defensive line. Each patient's moans were reminders of why he could not falter. Finally, they reached a shallow trench dug into the riverbank. Emil lowered the wounded carefully, checking vitals and administering morphine from a battered medical kit. The river flowed cold and dark beside them, reflecting the gray sky, indifferent to the blood and chaos on its banks. Exhausted, Emil paused, leaning heavily against the trench wall. Mud caked his boots, his hands were raw, and sweat streaked through grime and blood. Yet he did not rest for long. The Germans were not done. Artillery shells continued to fall, and reconnaissance units circled, searching for stragglers and survivors. A medic approached, whispering urgently, "They're regrouping. Another wave is coming, and we'll need to move the rest across the river under fire." Emil's jaw tightened. He knew what had to be done. There was no time to grieve, no time to question. The injured needed him, and he was the only one with the skills to keep them alive. He adjusted his mask, gritted his teeth, and readied himself for the next phase of the evacuation. As the first rays of the morning sun cut across the battlefield, illuminating shattered fields and smoking ruins, Emil Reinhardt stepped forward, scalpel in one hand, a stretcher in the other, and a resolve that would not bend under fire. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a shield, a lifeline, and a force that was standing between death and survival. And as the Germans advanced, Emil whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the chaos, "Not one more life will be lost if I can help it. Not today." The morning mist over Normandy fields had lifted, leaving a harsh gray light that revealed the devastation Emil Reinhardt had already witnessed, and the destruction still closing in. The riverbank where the wounded had been evacuated offered little protection. Muddy trenches, hastily dug and barely deeper than the height of the soldier, provided minimal cover against the advancing German forces. Smoke from burning farmhouses and vehicles hung in the air, curling like ghosts across the shattered landscape. Emil adjusted his blood-stained coat and scanned the horizon. Infantry and armored vehicles moved systematically, methodically, like a predator encircling prey. Reconnaissance half-tracks and motorcycles scouted the terrain, reporting back to the main column. Somewhere beyond the river, Allied artillery fired sporadically, but their impact was distant and scattered, a feeble response against the organized German advance. He returned his attention to the wounded around him. A young soldier's leg was shattered, the bone protruding at an unnatural angle. Another man, barely conscious, had taken a bullet through the abdomen. Emil worked methodically, improvising splints from wooden beams and applying pressure to torn arteries. Each decision was a balance between speed and precision, between life and death. A sudden volley of gunfire erupted across the open fields. Emil instinctively dropped to the muddy ground, covering his head. The German infantry had reached a tree line that partially shielded the riverbank, their rifles and machine guns sweeping in controlled bursts. Bullets pinged off makeshift cover and ricocheted dangerously close to the wounded. "Move. We have to move them," Emil shouted, dragging a stretcher across the slippery mud. One hand clamped over a patient's chest to stabilize him, the other gripping the handle of the stretcher. Medics followed, their own faces pale with exhaustion and fear. A shell struck nearby, throwing debris and earth into the river. The blast shockwave knocked Emil to his knees, sending mud and water over the patient on his stretcher. He forced himself upright and continued, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder and the numbness creeping into his fingers. Every second counted. One misstep could spell death for all of them. The Germans pressed forward with chilling efficiency. A Panzer III emerged from behind the remnants of a destroyed farmhouse, its long-barreled cannon scanning the riverbank. Emil's heart thundered. He had no weapons, no cover capable of stopping a tank, and dozens of wounded men relying on his skill to survive. He glanced at the patients. Their faces were pale, some unconscious, some clinging desperately to life. Panic would do no good. Focus would save them. Emil barked orders to the medics, directing them to dig deeper trenches and drag stretchers to a slight depression in the riverbank that offered minimal protection from direct fire. The 1st German infantry squad reached the shallow trenches, throwing grenades to flush out any defenders. Emil moved between the stretchers, pressing tourniquets and muttering encouragement. "Hold on, just a little longer." His voice was steady, though his chest pounded with adrenaline. A medic stumbled, his hands slick with blood, dropping a stretcher into the mud. Emil lunged, saving the wounded soldier from sliding into the river. A bullet whizzed past, grazing the medic's shoulder, tearing through his uniform but leaving him alive. Emil's fingers shook as he helped lift the stretcher again, mud and blood mixing in an indistinguishable paste. From the far side of the field, German machine guns opened fire. A stream of bullets tore into the earth, sending clods of mud and debris into the air. Emil forced himself to remain calm, focusing on the rhythm of triage. Stabilize, move, protect. A shell landed directly in the riverbank trench, collapsing part of it and sending one soldier tumbling into the water. Emil dove after him, yanking him back onto dry land. The man coughed, water and blood spilling from his mouth, but he survived. Emil barely had time to breathe before returning to the next patient. The Panzer III fired again, shells thudding into the muddy banks, splintering wood and earth. Emil knew he could not stop the tank. His only chance was speed, improvisation, and endurance. He moved along the trench, performing rapid field surgery, applying pressure to arteries, stopping internal bleeding as best as he could, and administering morphine to dull pain. Hours passed like minutes. Each wave of German advance was met with Emil's relentless determination. Medics were exhausted. Soldiers moaned in pain. Yet the doctor pressed on, a single force holding a fragile lifeline between life and death. By mid-afternoon, the German forces paused momentarily, regrouping and resupplying. Emil allowed himself a brief glance around. The riverbank was a mess of mud, blood, and shattered limbs, but most of his patients were still alive. He took a deep breath, knowing that the quiet would not last. The next wave would come, and he would continue, operating under fire with no reinforcements, no backup, only his skill, his courage, and his will to save lives. He straightened, gripping his bloodied coat, eyes scanning the horizon. The Panzer III remained, a looming specter over the riverbank, while infantry crept forward, their rifles poised and deadly. Emil whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. "I cannot stop. Not for a second. Not for them. Not for anyone." And with that, he returned to his patients, hands steady, mind focused, heart pounding. the doctor who operated under fire, refusing to surrender to chaos around him. By late afternoon, the Normandy fields were a furnace of chaos. Smoke curled from burning vehicles and shattered farmhouses, mingling with a thick, coppery scent of blood and churned earth. The riverbank, Emil Reinhardt's temporary sanctuary, had become a fortress of desperation, a thin, trembling line between life and death. Every inch of it was soaked with mud, sweat, and the indelible weight of human suffering. Emil crouched behind a makeshift barricade, his hands trembling slightly, but steady enough to move swiftly from one patient to another. A soldier moaned weakly beside him, his torso riddled with shrapnel. Emil applied pressure, carefully removing jagged fragments while muttering instructions to a medic whose uniform was tattered and soaked through with blood. Every movement demanded speed and precision. Hesitation could mean the difference between survival and death. The German forces had regrouped beyond the shattered orchard, forming a tight line of infantry supported by armored vehicles. The Panzer III that had been stalking the riverbank earlier now pivoted along the muddy fields, scanning for movement. Emil's stomach tightened. There was no cover that could withstand sustained fire from such a tank. He had no weapons, only skill and sheer will. The first wave struck with terrifying efficiency. German infantry scrambled through hedgerows and over the churned fields, firing and tossing grenades toward the trenches. Medics and soldiers scrambled to shield the wounded. Emil leapt forward, dragging a man with a broken leg into the shallow protection of a trench. Bullets struck nearby, sending mud and splinters flying. A fragment grazed Emil's forearm, tearing through cloth and skin, but he barely noticed. Another medic collapsed beside him, smoke and blood covering his face. Emil dragged him to safety, replacing him with a volunteer soldier who had survived a minor wound. The cycle was relentless. Treat, move, stabilize, protect. He could not stop, could not rest. The wounded relied entirely on him. The Panzer III fired again, shells tearing into the muddy embankment. Trees splintered, dirt flew, and water from the river splashed high. Emil forced himself to stay low, pressing patients against the ground while scanning the advancing infantry. The enemy had learned the terrain, using every rise, ditch, and remnant of the orchard as cover to approach the riverbank systematically. A young soldier whimpered beside him, clutching his abdomen. Emil ripped open his uniform to assess the wound. Shrapnel had torn through muscle, leaving a small artery exposed. He worked quickly, improvising a clamp from surgical tools, applying pressure with hands slick with blood. The boy's eyes met his, terror mirrored in their depths. Emil offered a small nod. "You'll make it," he whispered. It was a lie, but a necessary one. A sudden explosion rocked the trench. A shell landed yards away, hurling mud, wood, and fragments into the riverbank. Emil's hands were coated with dirt, blood, and grime, yet he continued operating. Another soldier, unconscious and half buried in the muck, needed immediate attention. Emil dug him out, pressing a makeshift bandage over a gaping wound. The Germans advanced with terrifying coordination. Infantry teams flanked from both sides, using smoke grenades to obscure their movements. Emil realized that if they broke through the riverbank defenses, everyone under his care would be slaughtered. There was no choice. He had to act. He barked orders to medics and volunteers, organizing the wounded for a rapid transfer across a narrow wooden bridge leading to a safer trench network along the river. The bridge was exposed, a deadly choke point, but the only option. Emil personally lifted a stretcher, mud and blood weighing it down, and began moving the injured across the slick planks. Bullets ricocheted off and around him, splinters embedding in arms and legs, but he pressed forward relentlessly. A Panzer III crested the far bank, its cannon targeting the bridge. Emil froze for a fraction of a second, calculating angles, distances, and probabilities. There was no way to stop it directly, no cover capable of withstanding a direct hit. Only speed, improvisation, and determination could save the wounded. He shouted to the medics, "Move faster! Cover the stretcher! Keep them low!" Another explosion sent a wave of water and mud over the bridge, nearly tossing a stretcher into the river. Emil lunged, grabbing the edge, pulling the soldier back onto solid wood. His hands burned from contact with boiling hot splintered wood, his arms trembling from exhaustion, but he did not falter. The German infantry closed in, using the Panzer's presence as cover. Emil's group reached a far trench, where a few Allied soldiers had taken defensive positions. The wounded were lowered, stabilized, and partially shielded from incoming fire. Emil allowed himself a fleeting glance around. The riverbank was a battlefield of shattered earth, splintered wood, and exhausted bodies. But it held the line for now. His mind raced. Reinforcements were days away, communication lines severed, and the Germans were relentless. Emil knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The next assault would come, stronger, more coordinated. He could not afford to hesitate. A medic approached, whispering, "Doctor, there are more injured across the field. We can't leave them." Emil's jaw tightened. His body ached. Exhaustion gnawed at him, yet there was no choice. Lives depended on him. He scanned the battlefield, eyes narrowing, mind calculating the path, the cover, the risks. Stepping forward into the open again, he whispered under his breath, voice resolute despite the chaos, "I will not fail them. Not today. Not ever." And with that, Emil Reinhardt prepared to cross the riverbank once more, a single figure standing against fire, steel, and death, a doctor operating under impossible conditions, driven by an unyielding will to save lives. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Normandy fields, casting long shadows across the riverbank. Emil Reinhardt's hands were slick with blood, mud, and sweat, yet he moved from patient to patient with relentless precision. The battlefield had become a living furnace. Each explosion, gunshot, and shriek of agony a hammer striking the fragile shield of life he maintained. He was no longer merely a doctor. He had become the axis around which survival turned, a single unwavering force holding a line against inevitable destruction. A fresh wave of German infantry had advanced across the open field, using the cover of smoke and terrain to approach the riverbank. Emil glanced briefly at the horizon, calculating distances, cover, and timing. Beyond the infantry, armored vehicles rumbled forward, half-tracks, Panzer IIIs, and scout vehicles moving in a deadly coordinated advance. Every second that passed increased the stakes for the wounded under his care. A cry rang out from the far trench. One of the medics had been hit, collapsing against a stretcher. Emil dropped everything and sprinted to the mud, diving over debris and fallen comrades to reach him. Bullets sliced the air around him. The shrill ping of ricochets rang in his ears. He reached the medic, rolling him over, pressing fingers to the wound. A single glance confirmed the worst. A shrapnel-laced burst had torn to the side, near the ribs. "We can't lose you." Emil shouted, voice hoarse but commanding. Improvising with clamps, gauze, and adrenaline, he applied pressure to stabilize the wound. The medic groaned, pain etched deep into his features, yet he survived, at least for now. Emil straightened, wiping mud and blood from his hands, already scanning for the next crisis. Time became a relentless blur. Emil's hands worked mechanically, guided by instinct honed through countless surgeries and field triage. A young soldier with shattered arm cried out. Emil stripped the uniform, splintered the limb, and applied a field bandage. Simultaneously, he directed medics to reposition stretchers, move the critically wounded to safer trenches, and prepare evacuation paths. The Panzer III's cannon flashed again in the distance, shells striking near the riverbank, tearing chunks of mud and debris into the trenches. A half-track opened fire from behind the rising smoke, mowing down shrubs and splintering wood. Emil pressed himself against a sandbag, heart-hammering, but his hands never faltered. He loaded morphine into a soldier's arm while simultaneously guiding a stretcher past an incoming hail of bullets. Hours stretched like eons. Sweat, blood, and grime coated Emil's face, yet his eyes remained sharp, scanning for the next threat, the next wound. His body was beginning to falter. Exhaustion clawed at his limbs, pain from bruises and cuts threatening to slow him, but the wounded relied on him. Every second he hesitated. Every breath he paused could mean death for someone depending on him. Then came the sound that made him freeze, a German officer shouting, rallying a squad toward the riverbank. Emil's mind raced. The assault had escalated into a full-scale offensive, and the Panzer III moved closer, its cannon pivoting with calculated precision. The remaining stretchers of critically wounded were exposed, too far from the trenches to reach safety quickly. Emil knew that direct evacuation would be nearly impossible under concentrated fire. He took a deep breath and made a decision that would define his courage. He would lead the patients across open ground, under fire, manually dragging stretchers and guiding the wounded to relative safety. Medics and volunteers followed, inspired by his resolve. Emil's voice cut through the chaos. "On my signal, move fast. Stay low. Don't stop for anything." The order was a lifeline. Stretchers were lifted. Patients pressed flat against them, and Emil's team dashed across open mud and debris. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and mud. But Emil remained a steady heartbeat at the center. He lunged, ducked, rolled, and pushed forward, dragging wounded men over the broken field toward shallow cover by the river's edge. A shell exploded nearby, throwing Emil and the stretcher off balance. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself to his feet, clutching the stretcher, ignoring the burning cuts on his arms and legs. One wounded soldier's eyes met his, panic and trust intermingled in a fleeting glance. Emil whispered fiercely, "Hold on. You will survive. I promise you." By sheer determination and relentless pace, Emil reached a shallow river trench, lowering the wounded into the mud and water as carefully as possible. He checked vitals, stabilized limbs, and administered final doses of morphine to dull pain. His body screamed in exhaustion, but he allowed himself no rest. Every second of reprieve was temporary. The German advance would resume. As dust began to settle over the battlefield, Emil briefly surveyed the chaos. Smoke hung like a dark shroud. The riverbank was scarred and soaked with blood. Yet most of the wounded he had attended to were alive. His medics were battered and bruised, some unconscious from exhaustion, but still holding on. Emil's own body throbbed with pain, each movement a reminder of the cost of survival. Then, as the horizon glimmered with the fading light, Emil realized the magnitude of what he had achieved. Against impossible odds, under continuous fire, he had preserved life in the midst of death. And yet, he knew the ordeal was not over. Every life saved tonight was a battle. Every step forward victory carved from chaos. He sank to his knees briefly, hands pressed to the mud, eyes scanning the horizon for the next threat. His whisper was barely audible. "I will not stop, not while even one life remains in my hands, not while there is breath left to save them." And with that, Emil Reinhardt, the doctor who operated under fire, steeled himself for the final stretch, knowing that the crucible of this battlefield was far from over, and that true heroism demanded endurance beyond what any man thought possible. Night had fallen over the Normandy riverbank, but darkness did not bring relief. It only amplified the horror. Smoke from burning vehicles and shattered homes hung thick in the air, the smell of cordite, blood, and mud mingling into a stifling haze. Emil Reinhardt's hands were numb from hours of exertion, yet he moved tirelessly, tending to the wounded with a precision born from instinct and necessity. The Germans were relentless. Infantry continued to probe the riverbank's defenses, flanking positions under cover of darkness. The Panzer III, now a lurking silhouette in the dim light, had repositioned, threatening any attempt to escape or regroup. Emil knew this would be the final, decisive wave. He moved along the trenches, checking stretchers, adjusting bandages, and whispering reassurances to soldiers and civilians alike. Many were unconscious, some muttering deliriously, others wide-eyed with terror. Each life depended on his focus. Every breath a thread he could not afford to lose. "Doctor, the far trench," a medic shouted. "They're coming through." Emil glanced up to see shadows advancing from the smoke and wreckage. German infantry surged toward the exposed positions, rifles and machine guns ready. He assessed the scene instantly. The wounded were trapped, the terrain offered little cover, and retreat was impossible without risking their lives. He took a deep breath and made a split-second decision. Emil would hold the line himself, acting as a shield between the approaching enemy and the patients. He grabbed a makeshift barricade, a splintered wooden beam reinforced with sandbags, and positioned himself where he could slow the advance while directing medics to move the most critical patients toward relative safety. Bullets whipped past, striking the mud and sandbags, splintering wood, and sending shards into the air. Emil pressed forward, using his body as a human barrier to absorb the shock, shouting instructions, encouraging the medics, and dragging those who could still move to safety. His coat was shredded, his hands bleeding, and yet he did not falter. A soldier beside him fell, a rifle through his chest. Emil caught him, pressing fingers over the wound to slow the bleeding, and whispered, "Stay with me. Hold on." The man's eyes met his for a moment before closing, and Emil knew he could not save everyone, but he could try. He could not stop, not now, not ever. The Panzer III fired again, a deafening roar that shook the riverbank and sent mud cascading into the trenches. Emil ducked low, covering a group of wounded with his body as the shell exploded just meters away. The blast threw debris across the trenches, but the wounded were shielded. Emil emerged, coughing and covered in grime, immediately tending to those who had been partially buried. Hours seemed to collapse into minutes. Emil moved mechanically, driven by adrenaline and sheer willpower. Each action, applying tourniquets, administering morphine, stabilizing broken limbs, was executed with surgical precision despite exhaustion and pain. Every second of delay could mean death. Then came the moment that tested him most. A small group of German infantry had breached the outer trench. Emil, armed only with determination and improvised tools, stepped forward. He could not fire, could not fight conventionally, but he could use his knowledge of terrain and urgency to hold them off, guiding medics and the wounded into safer positions while making himself a conspicuous target. Bullets whizzed past him. A grenade landed nearby, throwing him backward, slamming him into the mud. Pain shot through his body. He tasted blood, yet he rose again, dragging a stretcher and a severely wounded soldier toward a slight depression in the riverbank that offered minimal cover. The Germans advanced cautiously, aware of the chaos Emil had orchestrated, but they could not stop him. With each wave, with each desperate maneuver, he protected lives through courage, speed, and ingenuity. The wounded were his priority, their survival the single purpose of every exhausted movement. By dawn, the battlefield fell into a tenuous quiet. The riverbank was a scarred, bloodied landscape. Mud and debris mingled with the remnants of burned vehicles and shattered wood. Emil sat, shoulders sagging, eyes scanning the horizon. Most of his patients were alive, stabilized enough to be moved once reinforcements arrived. Medics around him were battered, some barely conscious, yet they were alive. He allowed himself a rare moment to breathe. The cost was high. Countless injuries, lives lost, and his own body battered nearly to the breaking point. Yet through sheer determination and courage, he had held the line, operating under fire where no ordinary doctor could have survived. Emil Reinhardt rose slowly, surveying the aftermath. Smoke curled against the morning sky, but a fragile light glimmered through the clouds, a light that promised survival, hope, and a continuation of life he had fought so desperately to preserve. He whispered, almost to himself, "I did what I had to, and that is enough for now." With that, Emil moved among the wounded one last time before reinforcements arrived, the doctor who operated under fire having turned a battlefield of despair into a fragile sanctuary of life.